Chandeliers burned like captive constellations as the winter ball began its slow orbit around Power. Velvet, powder, and perfume turned the hall into a moving fresco, and the music stitched a bright seam that barely hid the chill beneath. At the foot of the staircase, a shy maid, Elara Wynne, kept to the shadows, carrying a silver tray and the small courage of someone who wished only to pass unseen. Fate, and a slipper heel, betrayed her. Crystal kissed marble, red wine unspooled like a wound at the edge of the royal carpet. Laughter arrived before mercy sharp, delighted, cruel. Lady Seraphine d'Aubray, scarlet as a warning, led the chorus with a gloved finger poised, as if ridicule were etiquette. Elara bowed to gather the shards, and from her wrist slipped a thin crimson ribbon, the kind a girl ties for luck. It fell between candlelight and whispers, a bright thread severed from dignity. On the dais, Adrien Vauclair, the vampire king, watched the room reveal itself. Beauty arranged itself around him like armor. Restraint kept the century at a distance. He studied the faces. Nobles who mistook humiliation for wit. Courtiers who fed on smaller hearts to feel immortal for an instant. Then his gaze found the maid hands trembling, eyes lowered, breath held as if air were a luxury she had not earned. The music faltered. A ripple of expectation moved through the crowd. Punishment, surely, or dismissal. Instead, the king descended the steps, every motion precise enough to quiet a room. He reached the ribbon first, lifted it from the floor, and turned toward the trembling figure. The hall braced for judgment. The chandeliers seemed to lean in. What followed did not sound like reprimand, it sounded like recognition. The king placed the ribbon across Elara's palms with a gravity reserved for oaths and coronations, and the laughter died as if someone had closed a door on winter. In the ledger of that night, witnesses wrote only this: the sovereign named the shy maid not an offense, but a measure of grace then, before a court that fed on appearances, called her the future their crowns had forgotten to deserve. The morning after the winter ball carried the echo of disbelief. In salons across Vienna, noble women whispered behind lace fans, and servants repeated the story in corridors that smelled of wax and envy. The king had defended a maid. It was absurd, intoxicating, and dangerous. Within the palace, the air changed. Some bowed deeper. Others avoided Elara altogether, afraid her presence carried the scent of scandal. She returned to her duties in silence, polishing mirrors that had never reflected her before. Each glance toward the marble floor replayed the laughter she'd endured. She could still feel the heat of the candles and the sting of Seraphine's voice laughter wrapped in perfume. Adrien Vauclair moved through the halls like a man guarding his own shadow. To the court, his gesture at the ball was theater, a moment of eccentric mercy. But to him, it had not been planned. The sight of her trembling hands and the cruelty that answered them had awoken something older than power, the memory of how it felt to care. It was a weakness he'd spent a century forgetting. That evening, he dismissed the musicians early and ordered the chandeliers dimmed. Only the candelabras remained, painting small halos in the silence. Through the mirrored walls, he watched the servants clear the remnants of celebration, and there she was again, collecting empty goblets with the caution of someone crossing through other people's dreams. He realized then that the court's laughter had not humiliated her alone, it had humiliated him, a ruler who claimed dominion over centuries, yet allowed cruelty to define his reign. In the servants' wing, Elara placed the recovered crimson ribbon inside her apron, folding it like a secret prayer. She could not understand why the king had intervened, or why his voice had sounded less like command and more like rescue. But she knew this. When he placed the ribbon back into her hands, the hall had gone silent. And silence, in a palace built on vanity, was the first sign that something sacred had begun to change. Days passed, and the palace held its breath around her. Elara Wynne moved like a shadow that refused to fade, careful, invisible, yet impossible to forget. The nobles still whispered, but now their mockery carried fear. No one wanted to be the next lesson in the king's gaze. Each evening, when the last candles dimmed, she worked in the ballroom alone, collecting glasses and forgotten masks. It was there, that Adrien Vauclair found her again. He entered without sound, the hem of his coat brushing marble like wind against water. She turned, startled, and nearly dropped her tray. "I have frightened you," he said quietly. She bowed. "Only surprised me, Your Majesty." He studied her hands, the same that had trembled under laughter. They were steadier now, touched by resolve. "You wear courage as if it were borrowed," he murmured. Alara hesitated, unsure if it was praise or warning. "Courage," she said softly, "is the only dress I can afford." The words broke the stillness. For a moment, he almost smiled. The centuries between them felt smaller than a breath. When she turned to leave, her ribbon slipped from her sleeve again, the same crimson thread he had returned to her at the ball. Adrien caught it mid-air and held it, his expression unreadable. Then, instead of handing it back, he tied it gently around her wrist. "Do not hide your grace," he said. "It belongs to no one's permission." The gesture lasted only a heartbeat, but it unsettled the air. For the first time, Alara dared to meet his eyes, ancient, weary, and filled with something too human to name. When she left, the hall felt changed. The chandeliers seemed warmer, the silence less cruel. And as Adrien watched her disappear into the corridor, he realized what terrified him most, not her defiance, but the truth that kindness had found its way back into his world. That night, Adrien Vauclair did not rest. He sat alone in his study, a chamber built for silence, where portraits of former courtiers stared from gilded frames like witnesses. The ink on his desk had long dried, yet his thoughts wandered restlessly through centuries. He could not erase the image of Alara Wynne, standing beneath the chandeliers with a red ribbon circling her wrist, the color of life against marble skin. He remembered the sound of laughter from the ball, the cruelty he had allowed to echo in his own house. How many times had he mistaken obedience for order, or fear for respect? The immortals of his court admired discipline, not decency. But the maid had done what no decree of his could. She had changed the air. He rose and crossed to the window. Outside, Vienna slept beneath the snow, unaware that its ruler watched like a ghost too polite to haunt. In the reflection of the glass, he saw himself as mortals did, unaging, untouched, unliving. The face that once held meaning was now only memory carved in perfection. For the first time in a century, he spoke aloud to the emptiness. "I protected eternity," he whispered, "and in doing so, I buried it." The words left frost on the pane. He thought of Alara, her humility unarmed, her presence uncalculated. She had not sought power, yet she had silenced a room of predators with a single act of grace. The king extinguished the candles one by one until only the firelight remained. Its glow trembled like doubt. When he finally closed his eyes, he no longer saw crowns or courts. He saw a maid standing unafraid, holding the gaze of a creature who had forgotten what it meant to be seen. Days unfolded like folded pages of the same song. The palace, once built from ceremony and fear, began to hum with softer rhythms. Alara Wynne continued her quiet duties, arranging candles, cleaning mirrors that reflected 100 years of arrogance. Yet, wherever she walked, silence no longer followed. To mock her it listened. Sometimes, when dusk painted the corridors in amber, Adrien Vauclair would find an excuse to cross her path. A question about the wine cellar, a missing document, a trivial request that required her voice. He told himself it was coincidence, but the centuries had taught him too much about truth to believe in it now. Alara always curtsied, always spoke little, yet her presence left warmth like breath upon frost. He began to notice the world through her pace. The dust caught in sunlight, the creak of oak doors, the scent of soap on her hands. The details of mortality that immortals forgot to feel. One evening she found him at the grand piano, a relic he had not touched in decades. He gestured toward it, curious. "Play," he said. She shook her head. "I only know how to listen." And she did. As his fingers struck hesitant notes, Alara closed her eyes, not out of reverence, but understanding. The melody faltered, but her stillness completed it. When the last chord faded, she bowed her head and whispered, "Even silence can heal, Your Majesty." The words landed like a prayer, disguised as truth. That night, the king walked the corridors until dawn, haunted not by ghosts, but by the sound of his own heart, learning its rhythm again. It began with a storm. The nobles had returned for another feast, restless and wary. Rumors of the king's strange fondness for his servant spread through Vienna like perfume. Lady Seraphine d'Aubray led the laughter again, her smile sweet as venom. When Alara entered to refill the goblets, Seraphine spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Careful, little dove. The king might mistake your blush for ambition." The table roared with delight. Before Alara could retreat, Adrien Vauclair rose. His shadow crossed the table like an eclipse. "Ambition?" he said softly. "You mistake her humility for the only virtue you lack." The laughter collapsed into silence. He walked to Alara, every step deliberate. She trembled, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of being seen. He reached for her hand. "If grace invites mockery," he said, "then let mockery become the anthem of the damned." He turned to the court. "You wished for spectacle. Remember this one." Then, before them all, he lifted Alara's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Gasps rippled through the hall. To the nobles, it was heresy. To the maid, it was salvation. For a heartbeat, the immortal court of Vienna saw its king as human, and that frightened them more than any thirst for blood. By dawn, the palace was colder than winter itself. The council gathered in secret chambers, their whispers sharp as knives. They spoke of bloodlines, alliances, and the shame of a monarch undone by sentiment. "End this," they urged. "Dismiss her. Erase her name before the world begins to believe in love." Adrien listened in silence, seated at the head of the table. The torches cast long shadows, turning his face half into myth. "You fear scandal," he said. "I fear decay. What kingdom survives when its heart turns to stone?" The steward rose. "Mercy has no place among the immortal." "Then immortality is the disease," Adrien answered. Meanwhile, Alara Wind sat alone in the servants' wing, the crimson ribbon on her wrist, the only color in a world of gray. She had not seen the king since the feast. Gossip reached her like frost under doors. She prayed not for protection, but for dignity, that she might leave without shame. That night, guards arrived at her quarters. No words, only an order. She was to be taken away before sunrise. As they led her through the courtyard, she looked up at the tower's light. It flickered once, then went dark. In the council chamber above, Adrien had extinguished it himself. Better they think him sleeping, while he prepared to wake the world. Snow fell as though the sky itself mourned. The carriage stood waiting at the gates, breath of horses rising in ghostly plumes. Alara clutched her apron, too proud to beg, too tired to resist. Then came the voice that halted everything. "Release her." The guards froze. Adrien Vauclair stepped from the shadows, cloak trailing frost, eyes alight with something older than fury resolve. "She remains under my protection," he said. The steward tried to protest. "You will damn the covenant." Adrien's gaze silenced him. "Then let it burn." He reached Alara and took her trembling hand. "If exile awaits, we go together. If the throne rejects mercy, I reject the throne." The gates opened, wind roaring like applause from unseen angels. He turned once more to his soldiers. "Remember this night, a crown that fears kindness deserves no head." As they vanished into the snow, Vienna's bells began to toll not for death, but for awakening. History would later call it treason. But in that moment, it felt like truth, setting itself free. Days later, the palace stood in silence. The nobles had fled, the city watched from its windows. Then, one morning, the gates opened again, not for guards or emissaries, but for the king himself. Adrien Vauclair walked beside Alara Wind, both cloaked in gray. He led her to the balcony where decrees were once spoken and faced the crowd below. "You were taught to fear difference," he declared, "to measure worth by lineage, but what greater nobility exists than compassion?" He turned to Alara. Before eternity, I name her my equal. Let this ribbon bear witness." He lifted the crimson band from her wrist and tied it around her throat like a coronet. "My future queen," he said. The crowd bowed, not from duty, but awe. From that moment, the legend of Vienna changed. The immortal who chose a mortal taught the living that love was the one law that did not decay. And above them, the sun broke through clouds for the first time in years. It did not burn him, it blessed him. Vienna, years later. The palace of Vauclair became a sanctuary of peace. Where laughter once wounded, music now healed. No throne stood in the great hall, only a single ribbon framed in glass, faded from red to rose. They said Adrian and Alara ruled not with decrees, but with presence. She grew older, her hair silvering like dawn. He remained unchanged, his immortality softened by devotion. When she died, the city mourned as if the sun itself had set. On the night of her passing, the king vanished from his chambers. At dawn, the servants found the ribbon missing from its frame. In the courtyard, frost glistened upon 2 footprints side by side, leading nowhere. And when the wind passed through the garden, the old gates creaked open just once before settling again. Those who heard it swore the sound resembled laughter, gentle and free. Thus ended the tale of the shy maid and the immortal king who called her my future queen, a love that taught eternity to kneel before grace.